Welcome back to Lullaby Atlas. Tonight, we travel through the streets of ancient Rome. Close your eyes, let the world fall away. Before the city wakes, there is a stillness that belongs only to the hour before dawn, a gray, soft hush that lies over the 7 hills like a held breath. The Tiber moves below, a band of dull silver between its banks, unhurried as always, carrying the last of the night's dark with it. The rooftops are only shapes, tile after tile disappearing into the pale sky above. Somewhere, very faint and far, a fountain is running, the only voice in the whole enormous quiet of Rome. Thin smoke has begun to rise from one street near the foot of the Aventine Hill, a single pale thread unwinding upward from a bakery where the ovens are being coaxed back to life in the dark. The smell of warm stone and ash drifts out into the cold air of the street, mingles with the river smell, and dissolves. Around it, the neighborhood is completely still, the doorways dark, the shutters closed, the stepping stones in the road catching what little light the sky is beginning, very slowly, to offer. A cart is moving somewhere in the distance, the creak and clatter of wooden wheels on stone, the slow clop of a mule picking its way through an empty street. By law, and the law was old even then, carts and wagons were not permitted in the city's streets during the daylight hours, so the city was fed and supplied by night, while it slept, grain and timber and wine amphorae rolling through the dark on iron-banded wheels. The whole commerce of Rome, moving through the streets in quiet before the crowds came back. Now the last of them are going home. The cart sound fades around a corner, and the quiet closes over it again. In a small square not far from the Forum, a fountain runs on, as it has run all night, as it will run all day, the water falling from a carved stone spout into a circular basin, spilling over the lip in a constant thin sheet spreading across the paving and finding the gutter channel cut into the stone, flowing on. Around the fountain's basin the stone is dark and wet. A pigeon settles on the rim, drinks, and sits very still. The sky above the rooftops is beginning to lighten, almost imperceptibly, from gray to a softer, warmer gray. Somewhere above, in a room with a shutter left ajar, a lamp is still burning. A small clay oil lamp on a ledge, its flame barely moving in the still air, throwing an amber circle on the plastered wall behind it. It has been burning since someone set it there in the deep of the night, and the oil is low now, the flame gentle and uncertain. Below it the street is absolutely empty, the stone paving slick with the damp of a long night, the shadows between the buildings still holding their darkness, not yet ready to let it go. Rome is asleep, or nearly so. A cock crows from somewhere on the Kilian hill, one long, declarative call that carries across the tiles and terraces and dies away over the river. Then another, closer, answers it. And the city, which has been resting in this suspended gray stillness, begins, very slowly, to shift. A shutter opens. A door scrapes against its threshold stone. The smell of bread, actual bread baking, warm and floury and unmistakable, moves through a back lane near the bakery, thickens and spreads. It is not yet light, but it is no longer entirely night. This is the hour the Roman day begins. Inside the bakery, the oven is a great domed cavity of brick, and it holds its heat through the night in its thick walls, so that by morning it is ready, the coals raked forward, the flat flour-dusted paddle laid out, the round loaves scored across their tops into quarters, as bakers have always scored them. In Pompeii, in a bakery that simply went quiet one ordinary afternoon and stayed that way, the loaves were found still waiting on their shelf. Round and dark and divided into wedges, the morning's bread that was never taken out, perfectly preserved in the stillness, smelling of nothing now but time. The Roman loaf was dense and satisfying, wheat ground in the millstone room next door, the millstone itself a great double cone of lava rock, turned slowly through the night, filling the air with a fine white dust. The flour was mixed with water and a little salt, leavened with old dough kept from the day before, shaped by hand, and slid into the oven on the long paddle. Pliny the Elder, who noticed everything and wrote it all down in his careful, inexhaustible way, observed that the best bread in Rome came from the professional bakers, and that the bakers of Rome were very numerous indeed. Now, in the first house in a quiet side street off the Subura, the hearth is being coaxed back from its banked coals. All night the fire has been sleeping under a layer of gray ash, holding its warmth deep inside, and now a little breath of air and a handful of dry sticks bring it back. A curl of smoke, then a small orange tongue of flame, then the steady, cheerful presence of a fire. The kitchen begins to warm. The smell of lamp oil, which has been hanging in every room of the house through the night, is gradually replaced by the smell of wood smoke and of water heating in a clay pot. The atrium floor is being swept, the long broom drawing slow arcs across the black and white mosaic, collecting the dust and the small debris of the previous day. A few crumbs, a fallen flower petal, the wax dripped from an evening lamp. The impluvium, the rectangular pool set into the floor's center, where the roof opens to the sky, holds a perfectly still surface of gray water that mirrors the pale square of light above it. Everything in the atrium is cool and precise and orderly in the early morning. The household altar in its niche, the small lamps trimmed and refilled and ready, the floor damp and clean. On the long, low table near the doorway of the dining room, the morning's food has been set out without fuss. A shallow dish of olives in brine, glistening and dark, a small jug of wine already diluted with water, 2 round rolls of bread still holding their warmth from the bakery, a smear of soft white cheese on a piece of fired pottery. The Romans ate their first meal lightly and quickly, standing sometimes, barely pausing. The serious business of eating came later in the afternoon. But the bread was good, and the olives were good, and the wine, even well-watered, tasted of grapes and sunshine and the dry hills of the south. Lamps have been trimmed in every room, the wicks pulled up with a small bronze pin, charred ends snipped away, fresh oil poured in from a narrow-spouted flask. The smell of lamp oil is one of the defining smells of a Roman house, persistent and faintly sweet, somewhere between olive oil and warm tallow, clinging to the plaster of the walls and the folds of the heavy curtains that hang in the doorways. Every wealthy Roman house burned oil lamps by the hundreds over a year. Seneca, who was thoughtful about such things, noted that the smell of the lamp in his study had become for him the smell of thought itself. The master of the house rises in the slow Roman way, dressed simply, in the tunic he has perhaps slept in, or a fresh one of undyed wool. A Roman citizen of modest means did not sleep in elaborate clothing, but neither did he sleep entirely without it. The bedroom, the cubiculum, was small and dark, its walls painted in soft ochre and terracotta panels, a narrow bed on a wooden frame with a mattress filled with wool, a woolen blanket, a small oil lamp on a shelf that has burned down to almost nothing. He rises, stretches, hears the city beginning outside, the fountain in the square, a vendor's distant call, the first footsteps on the paving stones. The salutatio, the morning greeting, was one of the fixed rituals of Roman social life, as reliable and precise as the water clock that measured the hours. In the early morning light, clients came to the houses of their patrons, men of greater wealth or standing, to pay their respects, to be seen, to receive small gifts or invitations, or simply acknowledgement. They waited in the atrium, quiet and patient, while the house came fully to life around them. The impluvium brightening as the sky brightened above the open roof, the smell of bread drifting in from somewhere deeper in the house, the sound of water being poured. The sky, visible through the roof opening of the atrium, was a changing thing. Gray in the early morning, then a pale blue as the sun climbed, Then, on fine days, a deep, luminous blue-white that made the walls of the atrium seem to glow. The impluvium collected rainwater in winter, but in the dry months it was a still mirror, holding the square of sky in its quiet surface, and the business of the morning salutation was conducted around it. The voices of the waiting men, a low murmur in the cool air, the master of the house moving among them with the measured courtesy that Roman social life required. Outside, meanwhile, the city has been filling with sound at a rate the sleeping hour gave no warning of. By the time the sun has cleared the eastern hills, the streets are thick with people. Bakers calling out the day's bread, a fuller's shop opened and already smelling sharply of the chalk and water of the trade. A carpenter's workshop opened to the street with the sweet smell of fresh pine shavings curling from the doorway, a boy running with a message tablet. Rome had perhaps 1 million inhabitants in its great centuries, and most of them lived and worked in the streets, outdoors, in the press and noise of the ordinary day. A water carrier moves through the street with 2 great clay amphorae hanging from a yoke across his shoulders, the water sloshing softly with each step, leaving a faint wet trail on the paving stones behind him. The aqueducts that fed Rome were a kind of perpetual miracle, 11 great arched systems at their height, carrying water from springs in the hills to the east, running day and night without stopping, pouring into the holding tanks on the high ground, and flowing out again through lead pipes and terracotta channels into the bathhouses and the public fountains, and the houses of those wealthy enough to pay for a private connection. Most Romans, though, fetched their water from the neighborhood fountain, a public basin on the corner where the street bent, the water running constantly, fed by a branch of the main supply, and cold even in summer because it came from deep springs far up in the hills. Women came with ceramic jars balanced on their heads. Men carried clay flasks by the handle. Children splashed their hands in the overflow. The fountain basin was also the place where neighbors met in the morning, where the gossip of the street was exchanged, where someone might leave a garland of flowers on a good day, a small offering to the genius of the water. In the bakery on the Aventine slope, the morning is fully underway, the loaves coming out of the oven on the long paddle, set to cool on the stone shelf, their crusts crackling softly as the heat escapes. The baker's arms are white with flour to the elbow, and the warm bread smell has moved out into the street and down the block, and people stop without thinking to breathe it in. A loaf cost roughly an as, a small bronze coin of modest weight, and a man could carry one under his arm all the way home without burning his hand if he waited just a moment, for the crust to settle from the oven's fierce heat. The Forum lies below the Capitol in the morning haze, its great paving stones already warm underfoot where the sun has struck them, the colonnades of the basilicas throwing long shadows across the open space. The basilica was the great hall of business and law, open at all hours, its nave as tall and barrel-vaulted as a very large room could be, the light coming in high and golden through clerestory windows, the floor worn smooth by the feet of centuries. Men conducted their affairs here, exchanged money, made agreements, argued contracts, with the unhurried gravity that Roman public life considered appropriate. And so the day has begun, fully and without hurry, in the way that Roman days always began, with bread and lamplight, with the sound of the fountain and the creak of the last cart going home, with the cool of the atrium and the warmth of the hearth, with the patient ceremonies of morning greeting and the smell of a city slowly warming in the rising sun. The gray of the dawn is gone entirely now, and the light across the tiled rooftops and the river and the hills beyond is the clean, frank, unhesitating light of a Roman morning, warm and old and very much alive. We step out now into the waking street. The narrow lane between the tall apartment blocks is already full of its own particular morning. The smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery at the corner, the sound of water running at the public fountain a little further along, and the cool stone smell of the pavement rising up as the first real warmth of the sun touches the upper stories but has not yet reached the street-level shade. The shop fronts stand open, their wooden shutters folded back, the interiors already lit with small lamps against the dimness of the ground floor. The bakery is the warmest place on the street at this hour. Its great millstones, tall, hourglass-shaped, the upper stone turned by a wooden beam, stand in the courtyard visible from the road, and the smell of the grinding and of the baking mingles into something dense and deeply comforting. Loaves have been in the oven since long before dawn. They come out scored on top, round and firm, their crusts darkened at the edges, and they are stacked on the stone counter at the front of the shop, still giving off a thin thread of steam into the cool morning air. A little further along, the cook shop, the thermopolium, has already set out its morning wares. The counter juts into the street, its surface a mosaic of terracotta and marble, and sunk into it are the great round jars, smooth-lipped, holding warm lentils, chickpeas softened overnight, yesterday's wine thinned with water. The smell of the cookshop is particular and domestic, wood smoke from the small fire beneath the counter, the gentle simmer of something with herbs, the faint salt of fish sauce somewhere at the back. People pass, slow down, exchange a few words, move on with bread in hand. The public fountain at the street corner runs all day and all night without pause. A stone basin, a carved mask, or a simple pipe set into the wall above, and water falling in an unbroken thread from the great aqueduct somewhere high on the hill behind the city. The neighborhood gathers here in the morning. Jars are filled. News is exchanged in low, unhurried voices. A child holds a palm under the falling water and watches it spill. The basin is always slightly green at the edges where the water runs perpetually over stone and cool to the touch even in summer. Across the street, where the pavement dips toward the drainage channel, the stepping stones are worn to a smooth hollow in their centers, from years of feet passing over them, one at a time. They are set just wide enough apart for a cartwheel to pass between them, and on market days the wheels of the grain carts grind the stone at the edges, leaving tracks that deepen season by season. In the morning, the stones are cool and slightly damp underfoot, and in certain lights, the whole street between them holds a shallow glimmer of last night's rain, still resting in the lower joints of the paving. The barber has set a stool just outside his door where the light is better. His tools, the small curved blade, the bronze mirror, the little pot of oil, are laid out on a cloth on the windowsill. The barber's shop is a place of long, slow conversation, and on a quiet morning, the talk is of nothing particular. Whether the figs at the market are good this week, whether the fountain up the hill has been running cloudy, a line of something overheard. The men who pass sometimes stop without being asked, simply to lean against the wall and listen for a little while before moving on. The lamp maker's shop smells of tallow and of fired clay, and the shelves that line the back wall hold dozens of small oil lamps in various states of completion. Some still raw and pale from the mold, some fired and darkened, some already fitted with their wicks, waiting. The shapes are familiar, the round body with its filling hole on top, the nozzle where the flame will sit, the small handle at the back. Some have molded decoration on the discus, a vine leaf, a dolphin, a simple rosette. They are modest, everyday objects, but at night, lit and placed in a niche, they make the whole room glow amber. The market, the Macellum, opens its colonnaded hall to the morning with the smell of fish and salt and ripe fruit all at once. The stalls are laid out in a simple order that everyone on the street knows by long familiarity. The fish nearest the drain channel, the cheeses and olives further in, the dried fruits and honey at the back where the air is warmer and the flies are slow. Figs are in season, small and dark, their skins beginning to split where the sugar pushes through, and they are heaped in shallow baskets that smell of the fig tree itself, green and slightly milky, the smell of late summer in every city of the ancient Mediterranean. The grain for the city's bread came up from the port at Ostia, carried on flat-bottomed riverboats along the Tiber, and unloaded at the wharves below the Aventine Hill. The sacks were heavy, and the river journey took the better part of a day, but at the market the grain appeared simply as itself, pale, dry, faintly dusty, smelling of the hull and of long storage in a cool warehouse. The writers tell us that the city consumed enormous quantities of grain and that the supply of bread was the first thing any administrator of the city kept watch over. Without bread, everything else went wrong. With bread, the morning was always possible. Garum, the fish sauce that Rome put on almost everything, had a smell that was difficult to ignore, and once familiar, almost impossible to dislike. It was made from small fish layered with salt and left in the sun to ferment over many weeks, and the finished sauce was amber-colored, liquid, intensely savory. It came to the city in small amphorae, stoppered with clay, and the cookshops kept their supply in earthen jars behind the counter. A few drops into a lentil pot, a small pour-over grilled fish, a little worked into a sauce with honey and vinegar. It appeared in nearly every dish, quietly, as the deep note beneath everything else. The potter's workshop opens off an alley, and the wheel is already turning by the second hour of the morning. The clay is a dark ochre red, the particular color of the local earth, and the hands working it are patient, moving with a deliberate, unhurried pressure as the walls of a bowl rise and thin. Water keeps the clay supple, and the wheel makes its own quiet rhythm, a low, continuous turning that is barely a sound and nearly a feeling. Finished pieces dry on wooden shelves along the wall, pale and still soft at the base where they were cut from the bat, waiting for the first firing. The glassblower's furnace is a small, fierce orange eye in the back of a dim workshop, and the glass on the end of the blowpipe is a molten teardrop that shifts color as it cools. Orange at the center, yellow at the thinning edges, green where the air has touched it longest. The glassblower turns and turns the pipe, and the bubble stretches slowly. Glassmaking was a Roman art much admired. The finished vessels, thin-walled and faintly iridescent, the product of considerable skill, and the workshops that produced them were small, hot, and quiet, except for the sound of the fire and the occasional soft exhale of the pipe. The mosaic layer works on the floor of a room in a new house, and the morning's task is a border of interlocking waves, the meander pattern, old as the Mediterranean itself. The tesserae are tiny, smaller than a thumbnail, cut from colored stone and glass, and they lie in small sorted piles beside the worker's knee: white limestone, black basalt, a terracotta ochre. The mortar bed is fresh and pale. Each cube goes in with a tap of a small wooden mallet, seated flush, angled just so. The click of tesserae is the quiet sound of the morning in this room, regular, small, entirely absorbed. The fresco painter works against time because the plaster must be wet. The wall has been prepared in layers. Rough mortar first, then a finer coat, and finally the smooth oricho on which the color will be laid. And the painter has perhaps 2 hours before the surface begins to dry and the pigment can no longer sink in and bond. The red of the background, the deep Pompeian red, iron-rich, the color of everything warm, goes on first in broad sweeping strokes, and the painter moves steadily, without hesitation, the brush held loosely, the line of the arm doing the work rather than the wrist. In a carpenter's workshop at the end of the street, the smell is of fresh-cut wood, cedar mostly, warm and sweet, and of the oil used to finish the surface. The workshop makes simple things: a table, a door frame, a wooden chest with iron fittings. The joinery is careful, the surface is smoothed with a scraper and then a piece of pumice, and the finished work has the slightly blonde, close-grained look of furniture made by someone who knows the particular temper of each timber. A cat is asleep on a pile of shavings in the corner. The shavings are pale and curled like small sleeping things themselves. The coppersmith's workshop rings with a sound that carries all the way down the alley. Not loud, but clear and bright, the tap of a hammer on a copper bowl held over a leather pad. The metal is worked cold, then annealed in a small charcoal fire to soften it, then worked again. The process repeats until the surface is smooth and the walls of the vessel even. Finished work hangs on hooks along the wall, ladles, small pans, a handled cup with a simple floral stamp around the rim. The copper is bright orange-red in the morning light, the color of a thing made to last and used every day without ceremony. By the 6th or 7th hour, what the Romans counted as late morning, our midday approaching, the pace of work on the street softens. The craftsmen set down their tools. The market stalls begin to thin. The midday meal, the prandium, was a light thing by any standard. Bread, perhaps, cold from the morning's baking, with olives pressed into a small cup of oil, a wedge of hard cheese, a few dried figs, some leftover chickpeas from the cookshop. It was eaten quickly, standing up or sitting on a step, with the warmth of the day already building around the stone walls, and the smell of the street shifting from morning cool into the fuller, thicker warmth of noon. In Pompeii, whose streets have been still for many centuries, the walls speak in a small, unhurried way. The writing on them was put there by ordinary hands, a charcoal stylus, a sharp nail, a piece of red pigment, and the messages are modest, a greeting, a name, a line from a poet that someone liked enough to copy down. Secundus says hello to his friends, reads one, in neat letters near a doorway. A child practiced the alphabet on a plastered wall, letter by careful letter, the form slightly uneven. A line of Virgil appears above a water trough, as if someone stopped, remembered it, and wrote it for no one in particular. The walls of Pompeii also carried election notices, painted in careful red and black letters by sign writers, naming a candidate and recommending him for this office or that. The sign painters worked by night or in the early morning, when the walls were cool and the paint went on cleanly. Some notices have a little formula at the end. His neighbors ask this, or the Bakers' Guild recommends him. The streets were read as well as walked. The writing on the walls was part of the texture of the place, as much as the stepping stones and the fountain, the ordinary noise of a community that expected to be heard and answered and remembered. The honey seller's stall at the edge of the market keeps its jars in the shade, because good honey is patient and does not want the noon heat. The jars are sealed with wax and labeled in ink, some with the flower, some with the region, because Roman buyers knew the difference between mountain thyme honey and the darker honey of the coastal marshes. Must cakes, baked with grape must and spices, sit on a cloth beside the jars, small, dense, sweet, the kind of thing eaten slowly in the morning and thought of warmly in the afternoon. The sweetness of honey was, for Rome, one of the uncomplicated pleasures available to anyone who passed this stall with a coin. By the time the 7th hour turns toward the 8th, the working morning is nearly done. The street is quieter now, not empty, but slower, the quality of movement shifting from purposeful to drifting. The sun is high above the rooftops, and the shadows have shrunk back against the walls, leaving the center of the street exposed and bright and warm. The craftsmen clean their tools. The cookshop counter is nearly bare. The market sellers fold their cloths and count the morning's coins. The city gathers itself quietly, the way a place does when it knows that the best of the day's work is behind it, and the long, pleasant afternoon, the baths, the garden, the evening's ease, is now very near. We leave the warm morning streets now and follow the slow drift of the afternoon crowd toward the great baths. Even from a distance, the thermae announce themselves, a low, warm haze rising above the roofline, the sound of water carried on the air, the smell of heated stone and olive oil drifting out through an open archway. The building is enormous, its walls thick enough to hold the warmth of a whole day inside them, its vaulted ceilings lost in a pleasant dimness above. People come here the way they come to the fountain, as a matter of course, an ordinary pleasure woven into the cloth of the afternoon. At the entrance to the changing room, the apoditerium, sandals are set down on cool stone floors, and the city's noise falls away behind the thick walls. The room is lined with niches, each just large enough for a folded cloak or a pair of shoes, each shadowed and still. The marble floor here is unheated, and the cool of it against bare feet is its own small pleasure after the warm dust of the streets. A single oil lamp burns in a corner, its flame barely moving in the breathless air. The smell of the room is clean, stone, a faint trace of cedar oil, the stillness of a sheltered place. Beyond the changing room lies the exercise yard, the palestra, an open courtyard surrounded by a colonnaded walkway, its center laid with packed earth and flooded with the full, unfiltered light of the early afternoon. Some arrive here first, before the baths themselves, throwing a small, hard ball back and forth with a practiced looseness of the wrist, the ball making a sharp, satisfying crack when it is caught cleanly. Others walk the colonnaded edge in pairs, talking in low voices, their tunics loose at the shoulder. The sky overhead is the deep blue of a Roman autumn afternoon, and the tops of the cypress trees visible above the colonnade are absolutely still. Seneca, the philosopher, once lived in a room above a bathhouse, not in a great complex, but a smaller neighborhood establishment, and he wrote to a friend about the sounds that rose to him through the floor and the walls. He described the grunting of the men who exercised with heavy weights, a sound he said came in sharp, hissing bursts whenever the effort was greatest. He described the crack of an open hand against oiled skin when the masseur's rhythm found its pace. These sounds drifted to Seneca as he tried to think and write, and he set them down with the patience of a man who had long since made his peace with the world exactly as it was. There was a drink seller, Seneca noted, whose cry came up at irregular intervals, a high, carrying sound that seemed to fill the whole building for a moment and then fade, absorbed by the stone and the steam. And there was a man who liked to sing in the bath, whose voice in the vaulted room became something larger and more confident than it perhaps was anywhere else in his life, a warm baritone bouncing pleasantly off curved plaster, its owner apparently convinced by the echo that he was magnificent. Seneca wrote of these intrusions with a kind of fond exasperation that reads, across all the centuries, as the mildest possible form of affection for the ordinary world. The first warm room, the tepidarium, receives its visitors with a gentleness that the eye notices before anything else. The light here is softer, sifted through small, high openings that let in the sky without the direct force of the sun. The air has a quality of held warmth, neither cool nor hot, simply temperature made into a kind of stillness. Marble benches line the walls, wide and smooth, and the great mosaic floor, sea creatures, octopus and dolphin, trailing weed, and a single wide-eyed fish lies under a skin of warmth that rises imperceptibly from below. The floor is heated from beneath. To stand on it is to feel the day itself pressing gently upward through the soles of the feet. The warmth of that floor was the work of an invention the Romans used so thoroughly and for so long that it became simply a fact of the world: the hypocaust, the underfloor heating. Beneath the marble tiles, beneath a layer of thick concrete, the floor was raised on small brick pillars, hundreds of them, evenly spaced, each no taller than a man's forearm, creating between the tile above and the bare earth below a low, dim passage through which hot air moved continuously. Far away, in the basement of the building, a fire burned all through the day and into the evening, its heat drawn steadily through that underground passage, rising through the walls, warming the rooms from the floor upward, entirely invisible, perfectly quiet. It is one of the quiet marvels of Roman daily life that a person could walk into the baths on a cold November afternoon, step onto a marble floor, and feel warmth rising upward, steady and reliable as a heartbeat, from a fire burning in a room they would never see. The machinery of it hummed along beneath the pleasant surface of the afternoon, entirely taken for granted, as the best comforts usually are. The warmth was simply there, the way the water in the fountain was simply there, flowing because the aqueduct was flowing, warm because the fire was burning, the whole great quiet infrastructure of Roman life, ticking along below the level of notice. The caldarium, the hot room, is entered through a heavy door that opens on a wall of white air. The steam is not aggressive. It comes as a deepening of the warmth already felt in the tepidarium, a thickening of the atmosphere, a softening of all outlines. Shapes in this room have halos. The light that comes down through the round opening in the ceiling, the window to the sky, arrives already diffused, already softened, so that the whole room exists in a kind of gentle dazzle, white and warm and without sharp edges. The pool in the center of the room holds water that is almost too warm to enter, its surface perfectly still except for the slow rise of steam from it. To lower oneself into the caldarium pool is to feel the body surrender in stages. First the feet, then the legs, then the slow sinking of the whole weight into water that holds the day's tension the way a sponge holds water, gently and completely. The smell of the room is warm stone and wet plaster and something mineral, the breath of the earth itself conducted through miles of pipe and stone to arrive here, in this quiet cloud of warmth. High above, through the circular window, a square of sky is visible, very blue, very still, very far away. It is possible to look at that square of sky and feel just for a moment as though the whole of the city were very small and very safe and very far below. The light through the high windows of the caldarium changes through the afternoon in a way that the regular bather comes to know without thinking about it. The full white blaze of early afternoon giving way slowly to a warmer, more amber quality as the sun moves west, so that the steam itself takes on a golden color in the later hours, and the pool, which in midday was nearly white, holds in the late afternoon the color of pale honey. Pliny the Younger, who was a man of precise observation, noted the particular quality of light in such enclosed spaces, how it arrived transformed, how it settled on the water with a softness that open sky never quite produced. After the hot room, the cold plunge, the frigidarium, and there is no way to prepare for it that makes any difference at all. The pool is large, fed by water that arrives from the aqueduct without passing through any furnace, without any warming, cold and clean, and entirely indifferent to the temperature of the body entering it. The shock of it is, in the Roman understanding, the whole point. The blood rushing to the surface, the skin tightening, the breath coming sharp, and then, in the seconds that follow, a clarity and alertness that feels like waking from sleep into a world that is very bright and very particular. The cold pool always smells of clean stone and fresh water, and the room around it is the coolest, calmest room in the whole building. After the cold plunge, the body is oiled. A small flask of olive oil, carried in from the street in a little leather bag along with the bronze strigil, is poured into the palm and worked across the skin with a careful, unhurried attention. The oil is warm, slightly fragrant, and the skin, after the heat and cold of the baths, receives it with an almost audible gratitude. Then the strigil, the long, gently curved bronze scraper, is drawn across the oiled surface, lifting away the oil along with whatever the baths have loosened, leaving the skin clean and faintly gleaming. The strigil is a small, modest, perfectly designed object that the Romans used without ceremony, the way one uses any tool that works exactly as it should. The oil used in the baths was always olive oil, pressed in great stone mills from the fruit of trees that grew in groves all around the Mediterranean, transported in tall amphorae sealed with pitch and stacked in the holds of ships and in the back rooms of shops. By the time it reached the bath-goer's flask, it had traveled perhaps from the hills above Naples, or the long groves of Spain, or the terraced slopes of North Africa. It arrived carrying no history of its journey, simply present in the palm, warm and faintly green-gold in color, smelling of fruit and stone and sunlight. It was the smell of cleanliness in Rome, as particular and specific as the smell of wood smoke in autumn. Seneca noted among the sounds of his bathhouse the cry of the drink seller, and this small detail opens a whole corner of the Roman bath into view, for the baths were also, in their easy way, a place to eat and drink a little. A man with a tray of cups moved among the resting bathers in the tepidarium and along the colonnaded yard, offering watered wine and sometimes a small cake or a handful of olives. The cups were cheap pottery, unglazed, slightly rough to the touch, and the wine was cool and thin. Not a wine for a formal dinner, but a wine for the middle of a comfortable afternoon, drunk while sitting on warm marble, with the sounds of water and echoing voices all around. The great public baths built by the emperors, the enormous complexes that could hold thousands of people in their heated halls and gardens and libraries and colonnaded walkways, were something different in scale from the neighborhood bathhouse Seneca describes, but the pleasure was the same. These vast buildings were gifts to the city from the emperors who built them, free or nearly free to enter, their doors open every afternoon to the whole of Rome. A visitor walking through their gardens in the late afternoon would pass under stone archways wide enough to drive a cart through, their ceilings decorated with colored mosaic that caught the angled afternoon light and gave it back in tiny squares of gold and blue and red. As the afternoon lengthened and the shadows of the colonnades stretched across the palestra, the baths grew quieter. The calls of the drink seller faded. The ball games wound down without ceremony. The man who sang in the bath, whose voice had filled the caldarium so magnificently for a long, warm hour, fell silent at last, dressed himself in the appetiterium, and walked back out through the archway into the street. The steam in the hot rooms, undisturbed now, lay very still. The mosaic fish on the floor of the tepidarium, unchanging, looked up through the warm water with the same mild expressions they had worn all day, and would wear all evening and through the night. The bath complex had its own smell at this hour, the particular smell of a warm stone building emptying at the end of the afternoon, somewhere between the deep mineral warmth of the heated rooms and the fresher, cooler air beginning to come in through the open archways from the street outside. It was a smell that any Roman who went to the baths regularly would have known as the smell of the day turning, of the afternoon giving way to the evening, of the pleasant work of relaxation coming to its natural end. The furnace far below still burned, still pushed its warmth up through the pillared dark and into the marble floors, but the rooms above were quiet now, and the light in them had gone golden and long. A last visitor sits on a marble bench in the tepidarium, drying slowly in the warm air, in no hurry at all. The cup of watered wine he bought an hour ago is still half full. The strigil lies beside him on the bench, clean and cold. Outside, the light on the rooftops of Rome is turning the color of the wine, deep amber at the edges, pale gold at the center, and the sounds of the street, which had seemed very far away all afternoon, are beginning to come back. A cart, a voice, the distant drip and chime of a fountain. He sits with the particular contentment of a man who has spent an afternoon well, in warmth and water and ordinary human company. The baths close as the day closes. Not all at once, but gradually, the way warmth leaves a room after the fire goes low. The last visitors drift out through the wide entrance and into the street, which is cooler now and blue-shadowed, the afternoon light gone entirely from the lower walls, the sky above the rooftops still pale and clear. The furnace will burn a little longer, keeping the floors warm for no one in particular, ticking over out of habit or efficiency or simple inertia, until it too is let to cool. The mosaic floors hold their warmth long after the fires drop. The marble releases it slowly, evenly into the empty air of the rooms, like a body releasing the last warmth of a long, comfortable sleep. And then the great bath complex is empty, and the sounds that filled it all afternoon, the voices and the echoes, the slap of water, the distant singing in the vaulted room, are entirely gone, and what remains is the breath of the warm stone, the still pool in the caldarium holding a last square of violet sky in its surface, the mosaic creatures on the floor perfectly composed in the silence, the hypocaust below cooling by degrees, its heat ascending through the pillared dark and through the marble above it, one final slow exhalation of warmth into the quiet rooms, the way the afternoon itself exhales before it becomes evening, before the lamps are lit, before the city gathers itself gently toward the long and comfortable dark. We leave the warm baths now and follow the streets toward home and the evening lamp. The house announces itself before it is entered. The street outside is loud still, a cart rattling somewhere distant, voices calling across an upper floor, and then there is the entrance passage, the narrow throat of the house, and all of that noise stays behind it. Stone walls on either side, close enough to brush with both hands, and already the air changes, cooler, stiller, faintly scented with the damp of interior stone and something green beyond. Past the entrance passage, the house opens, and the atrium receives its visitor the way a held breath is released. The roof above has a square opening, the compluvium, and through it falls a column of afternoon light, soft and slanted, moving slowly across the floor as the sun descends. Beneath that opening lies the impluvium, a shallow pool of rainwater set flush into the marble floor, smooth and perfectly still at this hour, holding the square of sky in its surface the way a mirror holds a face, quietly, completely, without effort. Around the atrium, the small rooms open like petals from a center, the cubicula, the sleeping rooms, each just large enough for a bed and a chest, each with its door open onto the cool central space. In the afternoon, a room like this would have been the best place in the house, shuttered against the light, stone-floored, with the faint sound of water from the impluvium drifting in under the door. A room made for resting, its walls perhaps painted a deep Pompeian red, a single oil lamp unlit on a shelf, the linen of the bed pale in the dimness. The tablinum, the formal reception room, stands at the far end of the atrium, open to it on one side and open, through a wide doorway, to the garden beyond. In the morning, a householder would have sat here to receive callers. Now, in the late afternoon, the room is empty and its purpose dissolved. Light passes through it from two directions, from the atrium behind and the garden ahead, so that the room seems less a room than a threshold, a long, quiet pause between the public world of the entrance and the private world of the garden, between noise and stillness. And then the garden. The peristyle opens around a central space that is all soft afternoon and the smell of clipped box and roses and warm stone, the colonnade running around it on four sides, each column painted at its base, the floor between the columns swept clean of leaves. A fountain at the center sends up a thin thread of water that catches the declining light and falls back in a small, constant, unhurrying sound, the one sound the house makes on its own, the one motion that never stops. The further into the house one came, the writers tell us, the quieter and more completely the world outside receded. A fig tree grows in one corner of the garden, its broad leaves casting a shadow that has moved slowly across the pavement all day and now lies long and blue across the far colonnade. Beneath it, the soil is dark and cool, and the tree itself does not move much, just an occasional slow turning of a leaf in whatever small breath of air finds its way over the rooftops. Roses grow along the inner wall, and their scent in the late afternoon is fuller than it was at noon, the warmth of the day releasing it, the cooling air keeping it low and close to the ground. The walls of the garden corridor are painted, and this is where the house does something quiet and extraordinary. The painter has covered every surface with a continuation of the garden itself: fruit trees in blossom, more roses, a painted fountain in a painted alcove, birds perched on painted branches, a blackbird with a berry in its beak, a pair of doves on a stone ledge. Looking from the real garden into the painted one, the eye cannot immediately find the boundary. The roses in the fresco are the same color as the roses in the ground. The garden simply goes on. There was a room in Rome long ago belonging to the household of the Empress Livia that was painted on every wall with exactly such a garden. No architectural frames, no panels, no breaks. Only garden running continuously around all four walls and across the ceiling above, so that the room had no corners visible, no boundary between one wall and the next. Only an endless soft landscape of fruit trees and roses and birds in perpetual gentle light. It was said to be a room made for rest in the heat of summer, a room that gave the eyes nothing hard to rest against, only green and flower and the small, bright forms of birds among the leaves. The Romans understood in a way both practical and tender that the eyes need a place to rest. The painted garden gave the eyes distance when the room was small. It gave them softness when the city outside was hard. A room surrounded by painted trees and birds and the suggestion of a breeze among the branches was a room that felt, for as long as one sat in it, entirely separate from the noise of the street, from the heat of the afternoon, from everything that pressed and demanded. The wall became a window. The small room opened onto an afternoon that never grew late. Still lifes, the Romans called them xenia, gifts for a guest, small paintings of the things a host might offer, a glass bowl of water with a green fig reflected in it, a bunch of grapes still damp from the garden, 2 eggs, a round loaf, a piece of honeycomb in a bowl, painted with such care that Pliny marveled at the craft, at the way a painted grape cast a painted shadow, and the shadow seemed real. These small images hung in passageways and dining rooms, quiet reminders of abundance, of the ordinary pleasures that required no ceremony: the fig, the egg, the bread. As the light shifts from afternoon to evening, the triclinium, the dining room, is readied for the main meal of the day. 3 low couches are arranged around a low table, one on each of 3 sides, the 4th side left open for ease. Cushions are settled. A lamp is placed but not yet lit. The room is small enough that the couches nearly fill it, which is the point. The cena is not a hall but a nest, the furniture pulled close, the scale domestic, the mood the opposite of ceremony. This is where the day finally gathers itself and sits down. The meal begins while there is still light enough to see by. The cena, the main meal, taken late in the afternoon and carried without hurry into the evening. Eggs and olives come first, cool and simple, with a little salt and a dish of pickled fish. Then something warm, a piece of fish or fowl roasted with herbs, or a thick lentil soup with cumin, the smell of which has been moving through the house from the kitchen all afternoon, warm and earthy and deeply familiar. The bread has a hard crust from the bakery oven and a soft interior that holds olive oil the way stone holds warmth. Wine comes in a simple pottery jug, watered, more water than wine for most of the meal, the wine giving the water color and a faint sweetness, the way honey gives warmth to something plain. The cup is plain too, terracotta, smooth from handling, and it fits in the hand the way a familiar thing does, without thought, without adjustment. Pliny, who had opinions about nearly everything, wrote approvingly of simple cups and simple food, of meals that did not exhaust the appetite before they could be enjoyed. The Romans of the countryside, he said, ate and drank like people who intended to sleep well afterward. As the meal moves toward its close, the lamp is lit. It is a small clay lamp, leaf-shaped, with a wick that takes a moment to settle into its flame, a brief, uncertain flicker, and then steadiness. The light it throws is golden and close, useful for a circle of perhaps 2 arms' reach and no further, so the room beyond the table falls into a warm darkness that is not unpleasant but simply the edge of the lamplight's world. Fruit arrives, a pear from the garden, figs still warm from the afternoon sun, a small dish of honey for dipping. The conversation, which has been easy all through the meal, grows quieter. Honey cakes come last, small, dense, made with spelt flour and poppy seeds, with a surface that had been brushed with honey before baking and had set to a deep amber glaze. They are not sweet in the way of pastry, but in the way of something old and careful. The sweetness of good grain and good honey combined simply and without embellishment. A Roman kitchen took these things seriously. The quality of the grain, the sourness of the ferment in the bread, the honey's origin. Linden or thyme or the dark honey of the mountains. These small decisions accumulated into the particular taste of a house, its flavor, its signature. After the meal, the couches are not immediately vacated. This is a thing the Roman Senna understands. The meal does not end when the eating ends. The cups are refilled, lighter now, more water, less wine, and the conversation turns to whatever it turns to in the good quiet of a full and comfortable evening. Cicero wrote of these hours with real feeling. The best conversations, he said, happened not when people sat upright at a desk, but when they reclined, when the body was at ease, when no one was in a hurry to leave. The lamplight holds the room. The garden fountain goes on talking softly to itself beyond the wall. The garden at dusk is a different place from the garden of the afternoon. The light goes from gold to a gray blue that makes the white columns glow faintly, makes the roses seem to give back the warmth they have held all day. The fountain sounds louder now that the birds have stopped. The painted wall at the far end of the colonnade darkens, its blackbird dissolving into the painted foliage, the painted fruit losing its color to the evening. And yet it does not feel like loss. It feels like the garden completing a process it began at sunrise, arriving slowly at rest. A small lararium, the household shrine, stands in a niche near the kitchen, as it does in nearly every Roman house, high enough on the wall that its lamp looks down over the room. Inside the niche, 2 small bronze figures, the lares, the guardians of the household, each in a posture of easy movement, each with a little cup raised, a garland of dried flowers from the last festival, a dish with a crumbled piece of bread and a few drops of wine, the morning's offering still in place. The lamp in the niche burns on its own oil, refilled each day, and throws a steady point of warm light that seems at this hour to be the still center of everything. Night settles into the atrium. The compluvium above shows stars now, 3, then 5, then a quiet field of them, the same stars that were there yesterday and will be there tomorrow, looked up at through the same square of open roof by whoever lived in this house before and whoever will live in it after. The impluvium below holds them in reflection, and between the real stars above and the reflected stars below, there is a few feet of still house air. And in that air the lamp on the lararium shelf, and the small sound of the garden fountain, and the smell of cooling stone and lamp oil and the last of the roses. The bedrooms are quiet. The cubicula, those small rooms with their red walls and narrow beds, receive their occupants early, For the day in Rome begins before the sun, and the body that began before the sun is ready, long before midnight, to be still. The shutter is not quite closed. A sliver of the courtyard's dim light falls across the floor, a thin stripe moving imperceptibly as the night advances. Outside in the garden, the fig tree is a dark shape against a darker sky. The fountain does not stop. It has not stopped through days and nights and seasons for as long as anyone in this house can remember. And so the house gathers itself towards sleep, the way all the houses in the city are gathering themselves. The lamps going down one by one, the conversations fading, the courtyards going still, until the only sounds left in the house are the fountain in the garden and the small breathing of the lamp in the shrine, and the city outside settling toward its own deep quiet. The aqueducts still running in the dark, water moving through the stone above the sleeping streets. The night carrying the whole enormous city gently, the way a slow river carries whatever it is given, without effort, without end. The water had been moving since long before anyone in the city woke, since long before the first bakery smoke rose over the rooftops and the first cartwheels scraped on stone. It came from the hills, from springs cold enough to make the hand ache, and it traveled toward Rome along channels of dressed stone laid with such care and such patience that the whole length of the journey, mile after mile across the open countryside, the water lost almost no height at all, dropping only gently, steadily, the way a long breath is let out. Arch upon arch the aqueducts went, striding across the flat campagna, outside the city, as though they were walking calmly toward some unhurried appointment. The arches were wide enough that a cart road ran beneath several of them, and in the early morning those arches framed squares of pale sky, one after another, diminishing into the distance like doorways opened through the same bright morning air. Above each arch, invisible from the road below, the channel ran steadily, full and quiet, carrying its cold mountain water onward without pause. Frontinus, who oversaw the water supply of Rome in the years after Augustus, once sat down and calculated how many streams were coming into the city, how many fountains they fed, how many baths, how many private channels. And the numbers, even written plainly on a page, have the feel of something almost dreamlike. The water came in from 9 great aqueducts, some of them stretching back through the hills for 40 or 50 miles, and together they delivered more water in a single day than many cities would use in a week. What was remarkable, what the writers seem never quite to stop marveling at, was that the water was never turned off. It did not arrive and then wait in a tank for the morning. It ran constantly, day and night, and where there was more than the city could drink or wash in, the overflow ran on through gutters cut in the sides of the streets, carrying whatever needed carrying down toward the Tiber, always moving, always finding its level, always going somewhere. The city was never wholly silent because of it. At the neighborhood fountains, the small stone basins set at street corners, and in the squares of every district, the water spilled over the lip of the basin and ran away down the street all day and all night, without anyone tending it or opening a valve. A person who lived in one of the upper floors of an insula, the tall apartment building, would carry a jug down to the nearest fountain and fill it and carry it back up. And this was the texture of mornings. The sound of water falling into stone, the wet flagstones gleaming. In Pompeii, where the streets have sat quietly for so long that one almost forgets they were ever busy, the stepping stones set across the road are worn in the middle in a way that speaks of thousands of crossings, thousands of mornings when water ran along the gutter and pedestrians stepped from stone to stone above it. The gutters are still there, the stones still there, still raised just high enough that a sandaled foot would clear the running water, which is no longer running, but which seems, if the afternoon light is right, almost about to begin again. The great public baths, which have appeared earlier in this long day, were among the largest consumers of all that water, and the sound of the baths from the street outside was partly the sound of water, pipes running, the plunge pool filling, the overflow finding its channel back toward the river. But the water reached quieter places too, smaller and more private. In the gardens behind the better houses of the city, water ran in narrow marble channels among the flower beds, and small fountains played in the shade of the peristyle, the colonnaded garden walk, throughout the afternoon. We leave the fountains of the streets now and follow a quieter path, through a gate in a garden wall, into the green stillness of the Roman garden at the end of the afternoon. The peristyle garden of a prosperous house was a space designed for standing still in. The columns of the walkway framed it on all four sides, and the planting in the center was precise. Low box hedges, roses, perhaps a bay tree shaped into a cone, and all of it was underlaid by the small, persistent voice of water in its channel, cool even in the full heat of a Roman summer afternoon. Pliny the Younger, who wrote more about his gardens than almost anything else, described the grounds of his villa on the coast near Laurentum in such loving detail that a person can almost walk the paths he walked. He wrote of a terrace smelling of violets in the spring, of box hedges that held the sun's warmth after it had left the sky, of a vine-covered pergola where he liked to sit and read in the afternoon, and of the sound of the sea beyond the garden wall, which came and went like breathing. The garden was the place where the day's work was finished and the evening could begin. The topiary, the shaped hedges, the clipped box sculpted into birds and letters and round globes, was a Roman invention, or so the Romans liked to believe, and it filled the garden with green forms that held their shape through the seasons, something orderly in a world that was not always so. In the great gardens of the villas outside Rome, the public pleasure gardens called the horti, box and rosemary and myrtle were cut into shapes so precise that they cast clear shadows, and those shadows moved slowly across the gravel paths throughout the afternoon, as though the garden itself were keeping its own quiet time. The bees found the box and the rosemary and worked quietly along the rows of hedging through the whole long afternoon, and their sound, that low collective murmur that seems to come from the air itself rather than from any particular creature, was the sound of the garden, the way the fountain was the sound of the water. Neither the bees nor the fountain required anything. They simply continued, and the garden continued around them, the light thickening slowly toward gold, the shadows of the cypress trees on the eastern boundary growing longer, a swallow passing over without a sound. There were gardens in Rome, and then there were the gardens outside Rome, where the city thinned and the umbrella pines spread their flat canopies against the sky, and the air changed from the dense, complicated smell of the city to something cleaner. Stone warmed all day by the sun, dust on a gravel road, the faint sweetness of cut grass from somewhere further off. A person walking out through one of the city gates in the late afternoon would feel this change within a few hundred paces, the noise of the city dropping behind like a cloak being set down. The horti, the great public and semi-public pleasure gardens on the hills and fringes of the city, were places of shaded walks and long views, of statuary in the glades and fountains at the path's turning. Not the focused, disciplined space of the peristyle, but something more open, places where a person might walk for an hour and speak to no one, or sit on a marble bench and watch the afternoon clouds move over the Tiber Valley. The city a low haze of smoke and warm stone below. The writers say that people went there to think, or to avoid thinking, which amounts to the same thing in the slow heat of a Roman afternoon. Pliny described another garden, at his villa in the hills of Tuscany, where the paths were edged with rosemary, and the box was cut into shapes that spelled out his name and his gardener's name in green letters. Something so gentle and so particular that it is hard to read without a feeling of warmth for the man who ordered it done. He wrote of a meadow at the far end of the garden, beyond the formal beds, where the grass was allowed to grow long, and of a small stream that crossed it, and of the sense, standing there, that the garden had decided to end and the world had decided to begin, with no clear line between the two. In the heat of summer, the coolest place in any garden was the deepest shade, and the deepest shade was often found where a vine had been trained over a trellis or a pergola to make a green ceiling. The leaves dense enough to block the direct sun, but not so dense that the air beneath was dark, a filtered, shifting, underwater kind of light, the kind that makes everything look slightly more restful than it is. Under one such vine, at Pliny's Tuscan villa, a dining couch had been set out on a marble platform beside a marble channel of running water. The channel ran along the edge of the stone table, a narrow groove of marble not more than a hand's width across, and water moved through it slowly, fed from a small spout at one end and draining quietly at the other. The lighter dishes, things in small bowls perhaps, or cups with their contents already eaten, would be set into the channel and would drift very slowly along the table as the evening progressed. It was not a practical arrangement. It was simply a lovely one, the kind of detail that belongs to an afternoon that has decided not to end too quickly. The light in the garden at that hour, the vine-filtered late afternoon, the first coolness beginning to arrive from the hills, had a quality that the Romans seemed to recognize as worth setting down in words and worth arranging spaces around. The writers returned to it again and again. The garden at the end of the day, the fountains still running, the box hedge still smelling of itself, the first swallows of evening quartering the air above the wall. Dinner was somewhere in the future, but the future was in no hurry, and neither was the garden. Back in the city, even in the narrowest of streets, the sound of water was present. A fountain at the end of an alley, a channel running under a wall, the overflow from the public bath's cooling room gurgling into the gutter. The water was woven into the fabric of the city so completely that its absence would have been felt as a kind of silence no one had a word for. The city had its voice, and its voice was made partly of stone and partly of the human traffic that moved through it, and partly always of water finding its way downhill. By evening, when the garden was given back to shadow, and the water in the channel caught not the sun but the first pale light of a lamp brought out by someone crossing the courtyard, the fountains of the city were still running exactly as they had been running all day. Nothing had changed in the water. It had no knowledge of the hour. It came from the same cold springs in the same hills and arrived by the same arches and flowed through the same channels, and would go on doing so through the whole night and into the gray light of tomorrow, continuous and unhurried. The aqueducts, far out in the countryside beyond the city walls, went on standing in the dark in the way that very large and patient things do. The arches making their procession across the Campagna under the stars, the channel above them carrying its cold water without any lamp to see by, without any witness, the water arriving at the great distribution tank, the castellum at the city's edge and being divided there into its three purposes: the baths, the fountains, and the pipes running to the houses of those who had arranged for a private connection, and then from those purposes spilling onward. And so the water moved all night, as it had moved all day, as it would move tomorrow, through the carved stone of the hills, and the arched stone of the plain, and the lead pipes of the city, through the neighborhood fountain, and the bath's great pool, and the marble channel in Pliny's garden, finding its level, finding the river, finding the sea. The city slept, and the water did not. It went on speaking in the voice of the fountains, a murmur in every quarter, the only constant in all the stillness, the thread of sound that ran through every sleeping hour, patient and cold and endlessly arriving. We leave the fountains of the sleeping city now and follow the road south toward a smaller town that kept its stillness in a different way. The streets of Pompeii are paved in great blocks of pale basalt, and the wheel ruts worn into them are deep as a thumb's width, worn not by any single cart, but by generations of them, morning after morning. The same grooves deepened across decades until the stone itself remembered the weight of the wheel. A person walking those streets today feels the grooves beneath their feet and understands at once that this was a real place, not a monument. The stepping stones cross the street at intervals, set just high enough that a person could pass from one side to the other without stepping into what the street collected: rain, water, the ordinary run of a busy town. The stones are worn smooth on their upper surfaces, smoothed by sandals and bare feet across years, too many to count. Between them, the wheel ruts continue uninterrupted, because the cart wheels dropped into the gaps between the stones, and the stepping stones and the wheels had long since learned to share the road, each keeping to its own course through the morning. At the corner where two streets met, there was nearly always a fountain, a stone basin fed by the town's water system, the spout worn to a soft round nub by countless hands cupped beneath it. A Roman town thought of its corner fountains as furniture, as ordinary as a doorstep, and a person thirsty in the street did not need to go far. The basin of the corner fountain in Pompeii is stained pale green where the water fell for years. The overflow ran in a small channel down the edge of the street, and the moss that grew in the channel was soft and very dark. The bakeries of Pompeii announce themselves even now by the great round millstones that still stand in them, made of dark volcanic stone, hourglass in shape. The upper stone fitted over the lower, turned by a beam, the grain fed in at the top, and the flour sifting down around the base. Several bakeries have been found with their millstones intact and their ovens still standing, the domed plaster oven mouth large enough to take a full-sized loaf on a long wooden paddle. One bakery was found with 81 loaves still in the oven, round, scored across the top in the old way, the same shape a baker would recognize today. The loaves themselves were round and dense, marked with a stamp that identified the baker, a kind of signature pressed into the dough before it was slid into the heat. One such loaf, found and preserved, still bears the marks of its scoring, the 8 sections radiating from the center like the petals of a flat flower. It is small, no larger than both hands cupped together. Something about its roundness and its smallness, its quality of being entirely ordinary, makes it among the most affecting things in any collection of ancient objects. It was bread. Someone was going to eat it. It simply waited instead. The snack bars of Pompeii, the Romans called them thermopolia, the warm food places, lined the busier streets in considerable number, their counters built of mortared stone and faced with marble fragments, round jars set into the countertop up to their necks. The jars held food kept warm: lentil stew, wine, olives, garum, the fermented fish sauce that a Roman cook used the way later cooks use salt, freely and without apology. A painted sign above one bar listed what was on offer. Another had small paintings of food on the counter itself, a kind of menu and pictures for those who found letters less easy than images. At the threshold of one house in Pompeii, there is a mosaic set into the floor. A dog, black and lean, caught in mid-bark, its chain shone taut as though it had just lunged. Below it, the words, "Cave Canem," beware of the dog. The mosaic is made of tiny tiles, the craft careful and considered, and the dog has a quality of real energy, the muscles of its chest forward, the tail raised. It has guarded this doorway ever since the house went quiet. No one it has barked at has been troubled by the warning for a very long time, and yet it remains at its post, faithful and permanent, more charm than threat, still doing its one appointed work. Beyond the threshold, past the entry corridor and the atrium with its rectangular pool open to the sky, many Pompeian houses gave onto a garden, the peristyle, a square of open ground surrounded on its four sides by columns, with a covered walkway between the columns and the rooms. The garden was often planted with roses, box hedges, fruit trees, herbs, rosemary, bay, the small bitter herbs used in cooking and in garlands for the household shrine. In the afternoon, the shade of the colonnade lay in long bars across the garden floor, and the air in the garden was cooler than the street, and there was usually the sound of a small fountain at the center. In the garden of the House of the Golden Bracelet, the walls themselves became a garden, painted on every surface with birds perched among fruiting branches, with fountains shown in blue and white, with the soft green of garden depths receding behind the painted columns. The painted birds are exact, a nightingale here, a hoopoe there, an ibis standing in shallow painted water. Whoever sat in that garden in the afternoon, shaded by the real colonnade and surrounded by the painted one, found themselves in a doubled world, the garden that grew and the garden that did not, each making the other feel more true, the painted birds singing in a silence that the real ones had no need to fill. The frescoes of Pompeii cover the walls of houses great and small, and their colors, the deep red the writers call Pompeian red, the soft blue, the warm yellow of the ceilings, have kept their quality in the sheltered interiors across the long, quiet years. The painters worked quickly into fresh, wet plaster, the pigments absorbed into the wall itself before it dried, which is partly why the colors stayed. One room in the Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the town's walls, has a frieze running around all four walls in figures larger than life, painted in a red so deep and even that the room itself seems to breathe, the color filling the eye completely, the figures moving through it like figures in a dream. The Forum of Pompeii was the open rectangle at the town's heart, paved in travertine and surrounded on three sides by colonnades, temples, and civic buildings. At its far end, the Temple of Jupiter stood on its raised platform, the columns visible from much of the forum's length. Standing in the forum and looking north on a clear afternoon, there was a mountain, green and very large, its slopes grown with orchards and vineyards that produced good wine. It was simply the mountain that sat above the town to the north, a familiar shape in every view, as unremarkable and as constant as the sky above it. The walls of Pompeii were covered in writing, not graffiti in the careless sense, but the accumulated record of a town that used its walls as a public surface. Election notices recommended candidates for civic office, painted in red and black by professional sign painters who worked quickly and legibly. Greetings were scratched into plaster. Someone loved someone. Someone owed someone money. Someone thought a friend was not as good as they said they were. A gladiator was called the delight of the girls. A teacher named himself there. The walls spoke in the voices of real people, specific and immediate, and reading them now is less like reading history than like finding letters in a drawer one had forgotten. In the public baths of Pompeii, the rooms follow the familiar Roman sequence: the changing room with its stone niches for clothing, the cool room, the warm room, the hot room with its vaulted ceiling, and the hollow walls through which the heated air moved. The floors of the changing room are laid in black and white mosaic, tritons, sea creatures, a man carrying a net, all rendered in small tiles with the confidence of a craftsman who knew the scene so well, the chisel moved without hesitation. The light in these rooms is always a little dim, a little golden, falling through high round windows near the vault's crown, softened by steam and stone. The small objects found in Pompeii are in some ways the most intimate. A glass jug, perfectly clear, the the glass blown thin enough that a hand's shadow shows through it, a bronze mirror, its reflecting surface gone dull but its handle still shaped for a palm, a child's clay horse, the legs simplified, the neck stretched forward in the way a child imagines a horse running, a set of bone gaming dice, the pips worn slightly by play. These things were not made to last forever. They were made for Tuesday, for this particular Tuesday, for this particular kitchen or garden or game, and they stayed when Tuesday stopped and became, in that staying, more tender than any monument. A coin found in Pompeii is so ordinary that it is nearly invisible. A small bronze disc, the face worn to a soft relief, the value marked on the reverse. In the 1st century, someone held it between 2 fingers and set it on a counter for olives, for a cup of wine, for a handful of figs, for a child's toy, and the hand of the person behind the counter received it and put it in a box, and the box was put somewhere and the coin stayed. It had circulated through perhaps 100 hands before that last one, and it is still only a coin, still only worth what it was always worth, which was not much and was enough. The fuller's workshop processed cloth, washing and treading the wool in large vats to clean and thicken it, then stretching it to dry on wooden frames in the open air. The vats in the fuller's workshop at Pompeii are still set into the floor, round-mouthed, the interior stones stained from long use. Beside them, the workroom opens onto the street, and the street side of the counter is painted, small pictures of the work being done, a kind of illustrated record of the craft. The fuller who commissioned those pictures wanted to be known for what he made. And across the long quiet since the workshop was last used, the pictures remain, cheerful and precise, the advertisement still running. In the afternoon, the side streets of Pompeii are quiet enough that the sound of a footstep carries a long way. The walls of the houses rise close on either side, 2 stories in places. The upper floors once carried on wooden beams, now long gone. The plaster of the street-facing walls is layered, each owner repainting over the last, so that in places where a section has fallen away, one can see the colors of older surfaces beneath. A kind of geological record of all the mornings someone mixed lime and pigment and decided the wall needed freshening. The lowest layer is always the oldest and usually the plainest, as though the first person here simply wanted the wall white. The gardens behind the houses of Pompeii have been carefully studied, the root channels in the soil, the planting patterns, the pollen preserved in the earth, and from this patient reading the plants have been named: roses, violets, irises, oleander, quince, fig, cherry, box, ivy, rosemary. The scent of a Pompeian garden in the late afternoon would have been layered, the warmth of the stone, the resin of the cypress, the sweetness of the roses, the clean sharpness of the rosemary bruised underfoot. A lizard on the warm stone of the garden wall, the shadow of a swallow crossing the grass, the sound of the small fountain. These were the afternoon, and they did not require a holiday or a ceremony. They were simply Tuesday. At the edge of the town, where the paved road left through the gate and the tombs lined both sides of the way, for the Romans buried their dead outside the city walls, along the roads that led away, the light in the late afternoon fell long and level across the stone. The tombs here are simple structures, a bench, an inscription, sometimes a portrait set into the stone. The inscriptions speak in the first person. I was here, I was loved. Do not forget to live. One says only, traveler, pause. Another gives a name and 2 dates and no other word, which turns out to be enough. The road goes on past them toward the fields and vineyards, and the light thins and the mountain sits above it all, green and quiet. The town is quiet now, as it has been quiet for a long time. The streets empty of carts and voices, the millstones still, the snack bar counter cool, the mosaic dog at his post by the silent door. But the silence is not an absence, it is a fullness, the accumulated presence of all the ordinary days that took place here. The bread baked, the coin exchanged, the wine poured, the child's toy set down on the garden path and left there. The frescoes are still bright in the sheltered rooms. The stepping stones still cross the street. The corner fountain has no water now, but its basin holds the shape of all the mornings it was filled, worn smooth in the place the hand always reached. And so the town rests as it has rested, with its bread and its dog and its painted birds and its worn stones. The mountain sits above it on the northern horizon, dark now against the evening, as it sat above every morning this town ever had. The wheel ruts in the street hold a little of the last light, the way a groove in stone always seems to hold light longer than the flat surface around it, as though the stone itself is reluctant to let the day go. Somewhere in a closed room, a fresco bird sits on its painted branch in permanent afternoon, the color still deep, the painted garden still full of painted summer. The town keeps what was given to it. It has always been good at keeping things. We leave the quiet town behind now and follow the road out into the open country. The road straightens as the buildings thin and the air changes almost at once, cooler, carrying the smell of turned earth and dry grass and something faintly resinous from the pines along the ridge. The city has a smell of its own, familiar and close. The country has the smell of distance, of things growing without being watched. The road runs between stone walls, and beyond the walls, the land opens in long, gentle rolls toward the sea. The villa appears first as a line of columns along a ridge, a long colonnaded terrace facing south, the way Pliny describes his own, set to catch every hour of winter sun, so that the light moved along the portico from one end to the other through the day like a slow finger tracing the hours. Below the colonnade, the land fell away in terraces of vine and olive, and far below that, on clear days, the sea lay still and flat and pale as polished tin. A place built not for arrival, but for staying. Inside the villa, the rooms were arranged around a central garden court, and the garden was the heart of the house, the way a hearth is the heart of a smaller dwelling, the place everything faced. The paths were edged in clipped box, and in the beds between them grew lavender and rosemary, and in summer roses of a dark, dusty pink that bruised the air with their scent in the early mornings before the heat came. A small marble basin collected rainwater at the garden's center, and birds came to it at dusk. Pliny wrote to his friends about these country days with a quiet delight. The way a man writes about a thing he still cannot quite believe belongs to him. Here, he said, the mornings were his own from the first light. He would lie still after waking and simply think, without purpose, without urgency, the way the mind moves when nothing is asked of it. He found that the mind, given silence enough, tended of its own accord toward the pleasant and the true, toward the things one actually valued, rather than the ones one had merely pursued. Deep in one wing of the villa, Pliny had built his room of perfect quiet. It was set apart from all the rest, reached through a passage, set behind double walls, fitted with double doors, each sealed against the other, so that no sound from the household could enter, not voices, not the creak of work, not even the sea when the wind was up. He called it the place where he was most himself. The room held nothing but stillness and the faint smell of cool stone. He went there, he said, to do nothing at all, only that. The working farm lay beyond the pleasure gardens, the vineyard descending in long, straight rows, the olive grove on the drier slope to the north, the threshing floor on a flat piece of high ground where the wind could be counted on. The farm had its own rhythms, older than any particular family that kept it, older nearly than the names of things. The vine rows had to be dug in winter and tied in spring and harvested before the rains of autumn, and the olives had to be pressed when they were ready and not before, and the grain made its own appointments regardless. Spring on the farm began quietly with the loosening of the ground after winter, the earth dark and wet in the mornings, steaming faintly where the sun first struck it. The vines were tied up along their poles with careful bands of reed, each one checked, each one coaxed toward the light. The smell of the turned soil in spring was unlike any other smell the year produced, rich and cold at once, as though the earth were exhaling everything it had held through the frost. Lambs were loud in the far fields, and the first swallows appeared without announcement. By midsummer, the heat settled over the farm like a great warm hand pressing everything still. The cicadas began in the olive grove before full light and did not stop until after dark, a sound so constant it ceased to be heard and became instead the texture of the afternoon itself, the sound of standing heat. The long noon rest was not a luxury, but a kind of wisdom. The fields were empty, the paths were empty, the villa rooms were shuttered against the glare, and under the shade of the colonnaded terrace, the air moved just enough to stir the dust. The threshing floor in summer had a smell that was sweet and dusty at once. The warm straw, the chaff rising in pale clouds when the wind helped, the flat stone of the floor warm through the soles of the feet. Grain had been threshed on that same floor, or one very like it, for as long as the farm had been a farm, and the stone was polished by use to a smoothness that no craftsman could have planned. The afternoon light came across it at an angle and turned the dust motes gold before they settled again slowly, one by one. Autumn came first as a change in the light rather than a change in the air, the angle of the sun dropping almost imperceptibly day by day, so that by late September the vineyard shadows reached further across the rows at noon than they had in August, and the grapes hung heavy and dark and warm in their clusters. The harvest was the one season that asked for hurry, and so the whole farm moved at a pace it did not keep at any other time of year, quickly, carefully, before the rains came. The smell of crushed grapes filled the air for days. The pressing was done in the cellar beneath the main farm buildings, where the air stayed cool even at the height of the vintage. The great stone press stood at the center of the room, and the must ran down carved channels into the waiting vessels of fired clay, sealed with pitch. The smell was overwhelming and entirely pleasant, something between fruit and wine and fermentation and sweetness. The smell of transformation, the writers say, of one thing becoming another. Pliny notes that the new wine changed the air of a whole district for days, carrying across the hills on whatever wind there was. The olive harvest came a little later, when the fruit had turned from green to violet, and the air had a first real edge of cold in it. The olives were spread on cloth laid under the trees, and the branches were raked so that the fruit fell without bruising, which mattered to the flavor of the oil. The press for olives was heavier and slower than the wine press, and the oil that ran first was pale green and smelled of grass and pepper. And this oil, the writers agreed, was the finest thing the farm produced, a flavor that held the whole year's weather in it. After the harvest, the farm entered its long winter rest, and the villa followed. The rooms that had been open to the garden all summer were now closed, and fires were lit in the smaller rooms in the late afternoons, and the smell of wood smoke settled into the walls and the wool of the hangings, a warm animal smell, familiar as breath. The vines stood bare in their rows, each one a small dark silhouette against the pale winter sky. The olive trees kept their leaves through every season, silver gray and unmoved, as though winter were simply another kind of afternoon. Winter on the farm was the time for the slow work, the mending of tools, the pruning shears sharpened on the whetstone, the baskets rewoven with fresh reed, the press checked and oiled against the coming year. It was work done by firelight in the early evenings, the small sounds of it, the rasp of sharpening, the pull of reeds through the fingers, mixing with the settling of the fire and the low wind outside the walls. The short days ended early, and darkness came before anyone was ready for it. And then the fire was the whole world for a while. Rain on the tiled roof of the villa in winter was a sound that Pliny describes with something close to tenderness. He would lie in his room in the mornings and listen to it, the steady percussion of the rain on terracotta, slightly hollow, slightly musical, the gutters running full, the garden filling its basin. Rain meant the cisterns would be replenished, the dry ground softened, the spring prepared. A good winter rain was a kind of promise. The farm understood this without needing to be told. All the tiles, all the gutters, all the channels in the courtyard ran toward the same low center. The colonnaded terrace of the villa faced south, and on winter afternoons the sun was low enough to reach all the way back to the wall, warming the stone to a temperature that was noticeable when one pressed a hand against it, faintly warm, as though the stone itself had decided to hold on. Pliny kept this terrace for the winter months in the way one keeps a particular chair by a fire, as the one spot where cold and light arranged themselves into something approaching comfort. He walked there in the afternoons, he says, thinking nothing in particular, watching the light shift. There were small baths in the villa, a private set of warm rooms fed from a furnace beneath the floor, which in winter were the most beloved rooms in the house. The floor was warm underfoot, the walls slightly damp with steam, and the light came in through small high windows set deep in thick walls, arriving as bars of pale gold that moved slowly across the steam. After a morning of work or a long walk in the cold fields, the baths of the villa offered the specific contentment of warmth earned, the kind that reaches all the way through. The country villa had its own lararium, the household shrine, set in an alcove near the kitchen where the warmth of cooking reached it through the wall. The small figures of the lares, the household protectors, stood in their niche between two tiny oil lamps that were lit each morning, and before them a garland was laid on feast days, or a few grains of salt and wheat, or a small cup of new wine from the estate's first pressing. In the country, the gods felt closer than in the city, perhaps because the sky was larger, or because the farm depended more obviously on things beyond its own choosing. Evening at the villa came in the manner of all country evenings, gradually, without announcement. The light in the vineyard softened from gold to amber, and then to a blue-gray that made the distances uncertain, and the swallows that had been low over the garden all afternoon gave way to bats that followed the same curved paths through the same still air. The lamps were lit inside, one by one, and their glow reached out through the open doors onto the terrace. The sea on the horizon held the last light a little longer than the land, a thin silver line, and then that too dissolved. Supper at the villa was nothing elaborate. A little bread, olives from the estate, oil pressed from the same trees visible through the window, a few figs dried in summer and kept in a clay jar stoppered with wax, a cup of wine cut with water from the spring. Pliny says this was precisely right, that the country meal was the one that tasted of its own place, that had the flavor of the ground it came from. He ate in the room that looked onto the garden, and the garden in the evening smelled of box and damp stone, and the lingering warmth of the day's sun on the path. Night at the villa was deeper than city night. The stars were visible all the way to the horizon in every direction, and the silence had a texture to it, layered with the sound of crickets and the occasional far bark of a farm dog and nothing else. Pliny says he slept at the villa with a completeness he never managed in Rome. Long, unbroken, the kind of sleep in which one loses all sense of time and wakes not knowing the hour, only that the room is dark and the night is still generous with what remains of it. The lamp went out, the farm breathed, the season continued turning. We leave the sleeping villa now and follow the road back toward the city, toward the warm glow of lamps in house windows, and the small sacred things kept burning through the night. Every Roman house, whether a grand townhouse on the Palatine or a modest apartment above a workshop, held somewhere within it a shrine, a little niche in the wall, or a painted cupboard, or a shelf no wider than a hand. And on that shelf a lamp was kept burning, and before it a small garland of herbs or flowers was renewed each morning with the same quiet faithfulness. The shrine belonged to the Lares, the guardian spirits of the household, not great gods of thunder and war, but intimate presences bound to this particular floor, this particular hearth, these particular walls. They were imagined as two small dancing youths, lifting cups, perpetually light-footed, and their bronze likenesses stood in the niche exactly so, a little festive, a little watchful, at home in the ordinary warmth of the room, in a way that the great gods of the temples never quite were. They were the spirits of the house, the way a scent or a pattern of light belongs to a particular room. Each morning, before the household stirred into its work, the lamp at the shrine was tended, the oil checked, the wick trimmed, the small flame coaxed steady. A garland was changed if it had wilted, a little wine was poured, or a few crumbs of cake set down. A few words were spoken, quietly, not unlike the words one might speak to an old relative. Grateful, habitual, affectionate rather than formal. Ovid, writing in the early years of the empire, described the Lares with a warmth that made clear they were less objects of theology than of daily tenderness. With the Lares lived the penates, the spirits of the storeroom and the the hearth of the house was sacred in its own right, older perhaps than any of the named gods. Just the fire itself, the one that cooked and warmed, and the habit, almost instinctive, of tending it with care. In the Roman understanding, the spirit of the hearth was Vesta, and she was present wherever a domestic fire burned. In the kitchen, in the central room of the old farmhouse, in the small brazier that took the chill off an autumn evening. Her worship asked nothing complicated, only that the fire not be neglected, that someone remember to keep it going. But Vesta had another home, a larger one, in the Forum at the very heart of the city. There the round temple of Vesta stood, a small building really, for all its importance, round and graceful and columned, set a little apart from the long rectangular basilicas and temples around it. Inside, no image of the goddess was kept, for Vesta was not a figure to be depicted but a presence to be felt. The sacred flame itself, burning in the middle of the round room, was the goddess, or the goddess's closest earthly form. The flame was tended by the Vestal priestesses, women who had given years of their lives to the keeping of it, rising in the night, trimming the wick, feeding the fire through every season, through rain and summer heat alike. Night after night, for as long as anyone in Rome could remember, the flame had burned without interruption. The Romans understood this in a very simple, very intimate way. The fire was Rome's own hearth, and as long as it burned, the household of the city was safe, the provisions were whole, the family would wake to another morning. There is something deeply sleep-friendly in the idea that somewhere in the city, always, someone was awake, tending a fire so that the rest could sleep without worry. The city did not go entirely dark in the night, and the flame in the round temple was the most constant of its small lights, the one that had never been let go out, the one that could be counted on in the same way one counts on the slow sound of a fountain, or the breath of someone asleep nearby in a quiet room, steady, unremarkable, and enormously reassuring precisely because of its steadiness. The Vestals moved through their duties with a quietness the city respected. When they passed in the streets, people stepped aside, not from fear, but from a kind of instinctive reverence, the way one might lower one's voice near a sleeping child. They wore white, and their hair was dressed in a particular ancient style that had not changed in centuries, and they carried with them an aura of long continuity. as if they were part of the city's stonework rather than its daily life. And yet they were as alive as the flame itself, as warm and careful and mortal. Every household understood the keeping of the flame as a duty that mirrored the great public one in the round temple. The kitchen fire was not merely practical, it was a thread in the same cloth. When a new household was founded, a marriage, a family moving to a new house, fire was brought from the old hearth to the new one, so that the continuity of warmth was not broken. The new home thus inherited a lineage of kept fires, a quiet genealogy of tended flames reaching back through the previous house and the one before that, all the way, if one followed it long enough, to some original hearthside in the very old world. Then there was Janus, the god of doorways, of thresholds, of the moment of crossing from one space into another. Janus looked both ways at once, his two faces turned in opposite directions, because the threshold is always the place between inside and outside, between yesterday and tomorrow, between the sleeping city and the waking one. Every door in Rome was in a small way his. The Romans depicted him on coins as a double profile, each face calm, each looking where the other could not, together seeing the whole arc of a passage in a single still glance. A doorway blessed in Janus's name was a doorway that acknowledged what all thresholds are, a moment of transition, a small pause between what was and what will be. The Romans would touch their door frames leaving in the morning and touch them again returning at evening. Not a formal prayer so much as a habitual acknowledgement, the same way one touches wood for luck, or pauses on a step, or stands for a moment in an open window before drawing it closed for the night. Janus was the god of exactly that pause, the held breath before the door swings. For a city that divided the day so carefully into hours, that watched the sun's movement across the atrium floor and the shadow on the sundial with real attention, the god of thresholds made particular sense. Every hour was a small doorway. Every sunrise was Janus opening the day, and every sunset was Janus drawing it closed. Not with finality, but with the same gentle habit with which the lamp was trimmed and the shrine garland was freshened. A daily act of tending, of marking the crossing, of saying in the simplest possible way that the passage mattered. The month of January bore Janus's name, and the Romans began that month with particular attention to doorways, garlanding the doorposts with laurel, exchanging small gifts of honey and figs with neighbors, saying aloud that the new year should begin sweetly. The garland on the door said, "This threshold has been acknowledged, this crossing has been marked." The honey said, "May what comes through here be good." It was religion at its most domestic, less a creed than a gesture, less a doctrine than a habit of attention, the kind that makes a house feel kept and a life feel tended. The festivals of the Roman religious calendar moved through the year with a rhythm the household felt as much as observed. There were festivals of sowing and festivals of harvest, festivals at which the storeroom was opened and its contents blessed, festivals at which the house was cleaned from floor to ceiling and the thresholds swept with particular care. The parentalia brought offerings to the family dead in February. The floralia in spring scattered flowers through the streets. The saturnalia in December turned the long nights generous and warm with lamplight and gifts and a loosening of all the ordinary formalities. The saturnalia deserves a moment's dwelling, because it was the great festival of lamplight and warmth, the one Romans seemed to remember most fondly. It fell in the darkest part of December, when the nights were longest, and it lasted several days. Days in which gifts were exchanged, in which the ordinary severity of the winter season was softened by deliberate warmth, in which houses were lit more generously than usual, and the smell of warm food and wine and candle wax and pine filled the streets after dark. Seneca wrote from his window during the Saturnalia, "The city was alive with unusual joy." But the daily religious life of a Roman household required nothing so elaborate, only the small faithfulness of the lamp, the garland, the few words at the shrine each morning. The Lares asked for very little, to be remembered. The Penates asked only that the storeroom not be forgotten in the gratitude for its contents. The hearth fire asked to be tended. These are the oldest requests a household makes of those who live in it. Older than theology, older than temples, perhaps as old as the first human fire set in the dark by someone who understood that warmth had to be maintained, that it did not sustain itself. In the houses of Pompeii, that quiet town preserved so perfectly in its ordinary afternoon, the Lararium shrines survive exactly as they were left. The painted niches with their faded garlands and their little dancing figures, and the lamps that have not been filled for a very long time. One can still see the care with which the images were painted, the small ledge worn smooth where the offering bowl rested day after day, the soot shadow on the plaster above where the lamp flame rose for years and years before the afternoon it simply stopped. The care is still visible. The faithfulness is still in the walls. There is something deeply consoling in the idea that religion, at its most ordinary Roman level, was not about power or judgment, but about keeping the fire, keeping the provisions, keeping the doorway safe. The gods of the household were not distant or demanding. They were present in the same way the walls were present, the way the smell of warm bread was present in the morning, the way the sound of the garden fountain was present in the afternoon. Simply there, noticed without alarm, part of the unspoken texture of a day lived in a particular place among particular things. And so the evening settled. Across the city, in the tall apartment buildings of the Subura and the wide houses of the Aventine, in the villas along the Appian Way, and the modest shops above which families slept, the same small ritual was repeated as the dark came in. The lamp at the shrine was checked. The flame was still burning. A few quiet words were said, or perhaps none were needed, the gesture of the checking itself being the prayer. I looked, and you were there, and the fire was whole. That was enough. That was perhaps everything. Deep in the forum, the flame in the round temple burned as it had burned every night for centuries. The Vestal on watch sat quietly with it, or moved quietly around it, tending what needed no tending except the tending itself, the attention, the presence, the simple human fact of someone awake in the dark beside a fire. Out in the streets, the city had grown very still. The fountains spoke. The last lamp in the last workshop window was checked and found steady. The day had crossed its threshold. Janus had let it through. The night held the city, and the fire held the night. Beyond the city walls, the great roads began. They ran out in all directions from Rome like the spokes of a wheel whose rim touched mountains and coasts and the far edges of the known world. And on a night such as this, the city behind them soft with lamplight, the fields ahead dark and still, those roads lay pale and silent under the moon, their fitted stones reflecting a cold, steady light that made the empty road look almost liquid, almost like a river running toward the horizon and never arriving. The Appian Way left the southern gate of Rome and ran without deviation for miles, bordered by stone tombs and old umbrella pines whose crowns spread wide against the sky like dark, patient clouds. The tombs stood in rows, some tall and round, some low and broken, some still bearing letters that the moonlight touched but could not quite make legible. Nothing moved along the road. The wind passed through the pine needles with a sound like slow breathing, and the road received it and was still. At intervals along every great road a milestone stood, a column of stones set into the earth, marked with a number and the name of the magistrate who had measured and maintained the way. By day a traveler counted them gratefully. By night they cast long shadows across the pale road surface. shadows that moved almost imperceptibly as the moon arced overhead. A milestone near the seventh hour of the night stood in its shadow like a sleeping figure, announcing a distance to a city that was itself asleep and could not hear. Somewhere along the road, at a distance a traveler might cover in half a day's walking, stood a way station, the Mancio, as it was called, a low building set back slightly from the road, with a yard and a stable and a room where a fire had burned earlier in the evening and now held only its embers. From the doorway, a single oil lamp hung on an iron hook, its flame small and steady in the windless air, laying a circle of amber light on the packed earth threshold, and no further. Inside, a traveler lay asleep on a narrow bed, a merchant, perhaps, or a message carrier whose bags already sat at the door, ready for the first light. A wool blanket had been pulled up close. The fire in the corner breathed with the faint rhythm of coals settling, and the room smelled of wood smoke and leather and the particular close warmth of a low ceiling over a sleeping body. The road outside was empty. The milestone 100 paces away kept its count in the dark, untroubled. The roads crossed rivers on bridges of stone whose arches had stood for generations and would stand for many more. On a night of still water, the bridge's reflection lay beneath it, arch for arch, in the dark surface of the river, a doubled world, one solid, one trembling just slightly as the current moved. A frog called once from the reed bank and was not answered. The bridge held the road above the water, unattended, patient, as it had held it through every night for as long as anyone could remember. The road climbed into hills, and the air grew cooler and smelled of pine resin and cold earth. Below, in the valley, a farmhouse showed a single lit window. Someone awake with a sick animal, or tending a newborn, or simply lying still and wakeful, as people sometimes are in the deep of the night, listening to the house settle around them. The road above them wound on through the dark pines, pale and purposeful, going somewhere distant that no one on this night was going. We leave the road now, following it in the mind's eye only as it runs on toward the sea, and turn instead toward the coast, toward the mouth of the Tiber and the port that Rome had built there. Ostia, the city's great harbor, where the river met the Mediterranean, and where the grain ships and the oil ships and the wine ships came to rest between their long voyages. By night, the port was very quiet, and the smell of salt and wet rope and the particular darkness of deep harbor water rose up into the air like a second tide. The grain ships rocked gently at their moorings, their hulls broad and deep and dark against the darker water. They had come from Egypt and from Africa and from Sicily, with their holds full of wheat, the bread of the city, and now they rested, their sails furled on the yards, their ropes made fast to iron rings set into the stone quay. The water lapped between the hull and the stone with a slow, patient rhythm, neither hurried nor reluctant, the same sound the water had made against this quay for centuries. Along the quay, the great warehouses stood with their doors shut and barred. Long, low buildings with thick walls that kept the grain dry and cool through the summer heat, and now in the night air kept whatever was inside in a deep, patient darkness. Pliny, who thought carefully about such things, knew that the supply of the city depended on this machinery of ships and stores and roads all working together. Yet even he, one imagines, would have found something deeply restful in the sight of it all at rest, the vast engine of supply simply breathing. At the mouth of the harbor, where the channel opened onto the open sea, a lighthouse burned. It stood on its platform above the water, its fire built high on a tower so that ships still out on the dark Mediterranean could see it from a great distance and steer toward safety, toward the river mouth, toward rest. Someone had fed that fire through the long night, as someone always had, the same patient, necessary watching as the vestal flame in the city behind it. Another kept light, another human refusal to let the dark be total. The sea beyond the harbor mouth was very still. A ship that had left at dusk was out there somewhere in the dark, making its way along the coast with the lighthouse growing smaller behind it and the stars growing more prominent above it. The sailors on such a ship knew the stars the way a walker knows a road, by feel, by repetition, by the small certainties of a path walked many times. The sea whispered against the hull. The lighthouse held its position. The night held everything in its enormous, unhurried hand. Back along the river, the city had grown entirely quiet. The last night cart had completed its rounds and stood in some yard with its wheels still slightly warm, its load delivered, the street it had worked now empty and cool. The paving stones of the insulae, the tall apartment buildings, lay damp with night air and showed no footprint, no shadow. An oil lamp in an upper window of a narrow street burned alone, its light falling on the wall opposite and on no one. A lamp that had simply not yet gone out, keeping its own quiet vigil. The public fountains ran on through the night as they always did, the water coming down from the hills through the aqueducts without pause or preference for any hour, flowing into the stone basins and over their rims and away down the channels beneath the street. In the deep quiet of the third hour of the night, the sound of a fountain carried surprisingly far, one basin speaking to another across the dark blocks, the whole city threaded together by the sound of running water, so that even in the silence, Rome was never completely without a voice. The watchmen, the vigiles, who walked the city's nights with lanterns and long poles, moved through the streets in pairs, their footsteps the only deliberate sound in the dark. They checked the locks on workshop doors and tested the bars on the bakeries, and paused at corners to listen to a city that had nothing on this night to tell them. Their lanterns swung gently as they walked, casting moving circles of light on walls painted with faded election notices and the advertisements of bathhouses and taverns, words that had been important once and were now simply part of the wall. A watchman paused at the corner of a street that opened onto a small square where a laurel tree grew beside a public shrine. The shrine held a small lamp, a garland already dry and beginning to curl at its edges, and two small bronze figures on their shelf, the local lares, the gods of this particular crossroads, this particular patch of city. The watchman did not think about them especially. He had passed them every night for years. But he paused, as he always paused, just long enough to note the lamp still burning, and then he moved on. The Forum lay open and vast under the moon. The great space that had been full of voices and negotiations, and the particular hum of public life all morning was now entirely empty, its paving stones cool and pale, its temples standing on their podiums with their columns bright against the dark sky. The marble seemed to hold the moonlight rather than merely reflect it, as if the stone had been absorbing light for centuries and was now, in the quiet night, giving some of it back, a temple pediment, a colonnade, an arch, all of it still, all of it patient. The statues in the Forum kept their long watch. A bronze Augustus on his tall plinth stood with one arm extended in the gesture of address, speaking to an empty square, his bronze face turned toward nothing and everything. He had stood through thousands of such nights, through rain and summer heat and the frost that sometimes touched the hills behind the city in January. The Forum did not need anyone in it to be itself. The columns and the arches and the pediments did what they had always done. They held the memory of the city in their proportions, and the night held them. On the Palatine Hill above the Forum, the great houses were dark, their windows unlit, their gardens exhaling the cool scent of box hedge and watered earth into the night air. In one garden, a fountain played into a stone basin, and the sound fell through the dark, like something remembered, the sound of water that had been there through every season of the house's life. Through the heat of summer and the gray winter afternoons and every ordinary evening that had ended exactly like this one, with the lamp gone out and the house breathing in sleep around it. And the aqueducts still moved. Out beyond the city walls, they strode across the Campagna on their long arcades of arches, tier on tier of stone, pale in the moonlight, carrying the water down from the hills in an unbroken stream that had not paused in living memory. Seneca, walking once in the countryside near the city, had stopped to listen to the sound of water running inside the stone channel high above him. It was not a loud sound. It was a low, constant, almost inaudible murmur, like the city thinking, like the world reminding itself that it was still there. The city slept. The roads ran on through the dark to their distant destinations, empty and pale, the milestones counting in silence. The lighthouse at Ostia held its fire over a calm black sea. The Forum stood open to the moon. The Lares kept their shrines. The fountains spoke to one another across the quiet blocks, the only voices now. The water that came from the hills and ran through the stone heart of the city and found its way at last to the sea, as it had always done. And the long night settled over all of it and held. The watchman made his slow circuit through the lower streets, his lantern a warm point of amber moving between the dark walls. He did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. The city was asleep around him, the shuttered windows blank, the doorways still. The cats of the neighborhood, the only creatures that paid him any attention, watching from the tops of walls with their pale, indifferent eyes. He passed the silent fountain at the corner, and its sound accompanied him a little way and then faded behind him into the night. The bakery on the side street had been quiet for several hours now. The great stone mills stood still in the courtyard, their circular grinding faces cold in the dark air. The domed oven itself held only a low bank of coals, enough to keep the heat living in the clay walls through the depths of the night, so that in the hours before dawn, the fire could be coaxed back without effort, and the first loaves could go in before the city had fully opened its eyes. The smell of old flour and warm stone lingered in the doorway, faint and good. The great public baths had been dark for hours. The fires beneath the floors, the long hypocaust chambers that all afternoon had breathed warmth up through the hollow tiles and into the pools, were burning very low now, tended to just enough to preserve the heat in the stone overnight, so that the walls themselves would still be warm to the touch come morning. The pools lay still and black, their surfaces undisturbed, reflecting in a vague and watery way the last of the light that came in through the high windows. The steam was gone. Only the faint smell of water and old warmth remained. In the house on the hill, the atrium lay open to the sky as it always did, the impluvium, the shallow pool at its center, catching the moonlight and holding it quietly. The household had long since gone to their rooms. The dinner things had been cleared. The lamps in the colonnade had been extinguished one by one, and only the small lamp at the Lararium shrine still burned, its flame no bigger than a thumbnail, steady in the windless air before the little figures of the Lares with their offering bowls, keeping the old silent covenant between the household and its gods through the dark hours. The garden behind the house breathed its night scents without any audience now. The cool sharpness of box hedges, the sweetness of something flowering that would have been difficult to name in daylight and was more mysterious still in the dark. The marble bench beside the path was damp with dew. The small fountain at the center of the garden ran on as it always did, its sound unchanged, whether anyone was there to hear it or not, the water describing its small arc and falling back into the basin, over and over, as it had all through the long afternoon and through the dinner and through the settling of the house into sleep. Far out on the Appian Way, a cart moved slowly southward, its iron-rimmed wheels quiet on the flat stones. The ancient law, the one that had kept wheeled traffic out of the daytime city for centuries, meant the roads outside the gates belonged to the night. And on clear nights like this one, the carters preferred the moon to the torch, the road pale and legible under the open sky, the umbrella pines standing at intervals along the verge like patient sentinels, their shapes unchanged since the road was young. A donkey's breath made a small cloud in the cool air, and then the cart was gone around a long curve, and the road was still. The aqueducts did not sleep. That was the one constant of the Roman night. The great arched structures that strode in from the hills to the east and south, carrying their cold, clean cargo without pause or interruption. The water moving always in its stone channel, neither knowing nor caring whether the city below was awake or asleep. One could stand anywhere along the arches in the deep of the night and hear it. A faint, sustained sound, half trickle and half rush, the voice of the hills, speaking through stone to the city in the plain, and the city receiving it in its dozens of fountains and basins and pipes that ran beneath the streets. Down in the sleeping city, the fountains received what the aqueducts sent and gave it back as sound. Each neighborhood had its basin, its carved spout, its overflow that ran in a thin, bright thread along the gutter to the Tiber. All night they spoke to one another across the dark blocks, across the locked shops and the sleeping apartments, and the cooling stones of the streets. A murmur here, a low patter there, a sudden brighter note where a pipe ran fast into a wide basin. The whole city crossed and recrossed by the sound of moving water, so that nowhere in Rome was ever fully silent, not even in the deepest hour before dawn. The philosophers had always found something consoling in this, in the thought that the city's truest voice was not the market cry or the advocate's argument or the chariot on the paving, but this, the water that came from the hills without asking, that ran through the stone arteries of the city without ambition or haste, that gave itself equally to every basin and every cup and every garden, and asked nothing in return. Seneca, in his letters, had praised the ordinary life, the plain meal, the lamp at night, the sound of the city settling. The water was part of that. It had always been part of that. It was the last sound the city heard before it went under into sleep. In the country, a villa had been dark for a long time. The last lamp in the loggia had been taken inside hours ago. The vineyard on the slope was a pattern of dark lines in the moonlight, the vines low and orderly, the soil between them pale. The storage room held its amphorae of new oil in quiet rows. The kitchen garden was damp and fragrant, thyme and bay and fennel, and a single moth moved through it without sound. The well in the courtyard stood open to the night sky, the bucket on its rope perfectly still, the rope not turning, the whole place given over entirely to the dark and the dew and the deep country silence that the city never quite managed. Out at Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, the lighthouse fire still burned on its tower, a steady flame, high enough to be seen from the open sea, unchanged through the night. The harbor was quiet, the merchant ships resting at their moorings, their hulls dark against the black water, their rigging just barely audible. A faint creak of wood, a small knock of rope against wood, the sounds of vessels that had come from far places and were now simply resting. The river moved past them toward the sea. The sea itself was calm, its surface barely breathing, its vast patience unchanged by the smallness of the hour or the quiet of the sleeping port. The Forum, at the center of the city, stood open to the sky as it had always stood, its great paving stones pale in the moonlight, its temples casting long shadows westward from the moon behind them. The rostra, the speaker's platform, was empty, its stone steps silver gray in the night air. The columns of the basilica rose in their rows, their capitals lost in shadow. Somewhere in the middle distance, a fountain murmured. The stars above the Forum were the same stars that had always been above it, patient, indifferent, very old. The city dreamed beneath them, its stones warm from the day just finished, cooling now with a patience that matched the stars perfectly. The Palatine Hill was dark, except for the moonlight on its terraces. The old walls ran along their contours, the garden plots between them resting in the dark. A cypress stood black against the sky at the highest point. Somewhere below, a cat moved along a wall top and was gone. The city spread out from the foot of the hill in every direction, the rooftops pale, the streets dark, the occasional lamp in a window blinking small and orange in the vastness of the sleeping mass of it, all of it quiet, all of it in its own way tended, the fires low, the water running, the lamps burned down, the doors bolted, the gods in their shrines. The round temple of Vesta stood at the edge of the forum, small and perfect, its columns ringing the circular cella that held the sacred fire. The fire did not sleep. That was its nature and its purpose, to burn through every night of every year, tended and renewed, the hearth fire of the whole city made visible in a single steady flame. The Vestal who kept the night watch moved in the outer colonnade, her footsteps soft, her presence unhurried. The flame itself needed no attention at this hour. It simply burned, as it had burned the night before and the night before that, warm and unwavering, the city's oldest lamp. The Tiber moved through the city as it always moved, neither fast nor slow, gray-green in daylight, black now in the deep of the night, its surface catching the moon in long broken pieces and releasing them again downstream. The Tiber Island sat in the middle of the river, its stone walls shaped like the prow of a ship, the plane trees along its embankment dark and still. The bridges were empty. Their arches stood in the water, each one reflected below in a wavering twin, and the whole doubled structure, stone arch above, water arch below, breathed very slowly with the faint movement of the river, which was the breathing of the hills, which was the breathing of everything. The city sleeps now. Its bakery ovens hold their low coals until dawn. Its baths cool in the dark, their stones remembering the warmth of the afternoon. Its gardens run their fountains for no one, the water falling as faithfully in the empty hours as in the full ones. The Vestal flame is tended. The road lies quiet. The aqueducts still carry their cold water down out of the dark hills, finding their way through the stone channels into the sleeping city, filling the basins, feeding the fountains that murmur across the quiet blocks all through the night. The only voices now, the voice of the hills speaking to the sea, the city's long breath, slow and even, the day entirely let go. And it is enough now to rest. The long day has let go. The morning will come in its time, the gray light, the first smoke, the carter's wheel on the stone, the baker's fire, and the city will open its eyes again in the way it always has, unhurried and certain. But that is the morning. This is the night. The fountains keep talking softly in the dark, as they have always talked, and the one flame is tended in its round temple, and the roads lie quiet and pale under the moon. And the city holds all of it, all its days and all its nights, in the deep, patient silence of its stones. The garden fountain runs in the dark, and no one is listening. The water catches the moonlight as it falls and releases it again into the basin over and over, with a small sound that is neither loud nor soft, but simply steady, the sound the garden makes to itself when the household has gone in. The dew is settling on the marble bench, on the box hedges, on the petals of the rose that opened this morning and will close again at first light. The night-scented flowers are at their fullest now. The garden does not need to be seen to be entirely itself. The forum stands empty under the stars. Its great paving stones are silver pale and cold now, the warmth of the day entirely given back to the sky. The columns of the temples rise without purpose or audience, simply standing as they have stood, their shadows pooled at their bases. No voice, no footstep, no wheel on stone, only the distant murmur of a fountain somewhere in the dark beyond the colonnades, and above everything the sky, very deep, very still, the stars not moving in any way that can be perceived, the whole of it simply present, enormous and unhurried. The flame in the round temple of Vesta burns on, as it has burned through every night of the city's long life. It is a small flame, no larger than a lamp flame, perhaps, but in the dark of the cella it is everything, the whole warm interior held in that one steady point of light. The stone walls curve around it. The shadows lean away from it in every direction. Outside the columns, the forum is dark and cold. Inside this small circle of warmth and light, something has been kept faithfully alive, night after patient night, without interruption, without forgetting, the city's hearth tended through the dark. The road runs straight and pale under the full moon, south out of the city into the open country. The paving stones are perfectly flat, perfectly fitted, set down so truly that the road has not shifted in the lifetimes of those who know it. The umbrella pines stand at intervals along the verge, their flat crowns spread against the sky, their trunks dark. No cart, no figure, no sound, only the road going on, south and south into the dark fields and the sleeping farms. The road itself, a kind of silence, a long, settled, patient silence going all the way to the horizon, held in the white light of the moon. The oil lamp in the atrium has burned almost to nothing. The wick is very short now, the flame small and orange-red, trembling slightly with some movement of air too faint to feel. The impluvium pool below the open roof is perfectly black and still, a square of sky in the floor, a few stars in it, barely moving. The lamp flame dims, brightens once, dims again. The atrium is very quiet. The whole house is very quiet. The lamp has done its work, has kept the dark at bay through the long evening, and is almost done. The pool holds its stars. The flame holds its last light. The lamp gutters. The flame leans, straightens, leans again, a last slow breath. A curl of smoke rises in the dark, pale and thin, climbing without haste toward the open roof, toward the stars. Then stillness. The room is dark now. The pool is dark. The house is breathing in its sleep. Somewhere far off, a fountain. Somewhere far off, the river. The city murmurs to itself in the voice of its water, softly, all night long, and the night holds everything it has always held. The stones, the roads, the gardens, the one small flame still burning in its round temple. And it is quiet now, and it is enough, and the long day rests. And so the lamp burns low on our journey through ancient Rome. Thank you for traveling with us tonight. Until our next journey, Lullaby Atlas, sleep well.